Aperture priority is the topic of this week's video. It's a camera mode that you can use to create soft, blurry, out of focus backgrounds, which is a very popular look and is actually fairly easy to achieve. Of course, sometimes you want the whole scene to be sharp, you don't want the background to be blurry, and lucky for us, aperture priority mode can do this too. So if you want to know more about aperture priority and how you can use it to improve your photos, stick around and enjoy the video. Welcome to the Photo Genius channel. This week's video is sponsored by NordVPN. Hi, Paul here from Photo Genius. Welcome to my channel where I share photography tutorials and tips, all designed to help you get more from your camera so you can take better photos. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. This week I want to take a look at a camera mode called Aperture Priority. I'm going to show you what it is and how you can use it to be more creative with your camera and of course take better photos. So Aperture Priority is one of a series of camera modes that you can select using the camera's mode dial. This is typically found on the top of the camera. Please note, if you have a Fujifilm camera, it may not have the mode dial, but don't go away because I'll be showing you how you can also take advantage of Aperture Priority mode. So typically on most cameras you will see the options M, A, S and P on the camera mode dial. M being full manual, A for aperture priority, S for shutter priority and P is for program. Now on some cameras the labels may be different, with AV being aperture priority and TV for shutter priority. Now for reference, AV also stands for aperture value and TV time value. So all you need to do is to select either A or AV to put your camera into the aperture priority mode. Now if you're using a Fujifilm camera that doesn't have a mode dial, all you need to do is set the shutter dial on the top to A. Also make sure the ISO is also set to A. Now on the lens you'll find the aperture ring. As long as this is not set to A, you are now in the aperture priority mode. So what does aperture priority mode actually do? Well, when it comes to controlling how dark or bright our photos are, plus having control over things like background and motion blur, we can adjust three things: the aperture, the camera shutter and the ISO. Now the manual mode gives you full creative control over all three. These are collectively often referred to as the exposure triangle. But using the aperture priority mode simplifies things because whilst it allows us complete control of the aperture, the camera will help you out by adjusting the shutter and the ISO. Now if you happen to follow Photo Genius on the usual socials, you may already know that I'm about to head to London. I'm going to be hosting some photography workshops and I'm very excited. I'll also be sharing images and behind the scenes content to the channel. And whilst I'm travelling, you can bet I'll be using NordVPN to keep me and my data safe. So NordVPN is a virtual private network that can give you safe and private access to the internet by encrypting your connection and hiding your IP address. Features such as threat protection can scan your downloaded files for malware and other nasties that might infect devices. NordVPN can even monitor activity on the dark web and notify you if someone is up to no good and trying to use your password or credentials. So this is really great for me because it means that I can work remotely from literally anywhere and be confident that NordVPN has my back and is keeping my connection, data and identity safe and secure. Now another great thing about NordVPN is that it can protect up to 6 devices on a single account. So that way you're keeping not just yourself but also the rest of your family safe as well. Plus it's risk-free. There is a Nord 30-day money-back guarantee. So why not give it a try? All you've got to do to get an exclusive deal is go to nordvpn.com/photogenius. So now the camera is in the aperture priority mode, it might be a good time to explain what the aperture actually is and what it does. Of course, if you're already familiar with this, you can skip ahead if you choose or watch as a refresher. Now, aperture is actually a feature of the lens, not the camera. It is a mechanical opening in the lens that can be adjusted. By adjusting the size of the opening, this gives you the ability to control how much light can pass through the lens. Aperture is a feature of the lens, not the camera. It is a mechanical opening in the lens that can be adjusted. Adjusting the size of the aperture allows you to control how much light can pass through the lens, in the same way that the pupil of the eye controls how much light can reach the retina. So now we know what the aperture actually is, let's take a look next at how we can adjust the aperture and of course how that can then be used to affect our photos. Now, adjusting the aperture should be as easy as turning a dial on the camera. On this camera it's on the top, but with your camera it may well be on the back. And if you've got a Fujifilm camera, all you need to do is turn the aperture ring on the lens. Now, as you turn the dial, you will see the numbers on the back of the screen adjusting. Look out for the number that has the letter F in front of it, because this is the aperture value. Now, when it comes to the numbers, this can be confusing because a small number like f4, for example, does not mean the aperture opening is also small. It actually means the reverse. And likewise, increasing the f number, let's say to f22, does not mean the aperture is getting wider. It means it's actually getting smaller. So effectively, the numbers appear to be back to front, with the smaller the number, the larger the aperture, and the larger the number, the smaller the aperture. Now, in this video, I don't think we need to overcomplicate things by understanding why the numbers do work this way, but for anyone who would like to know more, you'll find a link to this video at the end of this video. Now, the aperture range will depend on the lens you have on the camera. As an example, here's a lens that many of you will be familiar with. It's the very popular 18 to 55mm kit lens. So dialing to the right, you see the f number increasing, which means the aperture is getting smaller. At f22, that's as far as I can go. However, with this lens, if I adjust the zoom from 18mm to 55mm and try again, I can actually take the aperture to f36. But now I want to make the aperture wider. Remember, this means a lower number. So I'm dialing to the left, and you will see this time I can only take it as far as f5.6. But if I adjust the lens again back to 18mm and try again, I can actually open the aperture to f3.5. So the aperture range of this very popular kit lens is f3.5 to 36. However, depending on the position of the zoom, the aperture may be restricted. Now, for some lenses, this isn't an issue. They are called constant aperture lenses, as the position of the zoom has no effect on the position of the aperture. And this also applies to prime lenses like this one. This is often called the Nifty 50. It's a very, very good lens. I've featured it in lots of my videos. The aperture range with this lens is f22 through to f1.8. So now that we know what the aperture is, we also know how to adjust it and how the numbers work. The next step is to understand how different apertures can affect our images. So choosing which aperture you want to use is an important part of photography, because aperture affects light and also something called depth of field. So let's look at these in turn, starting with how aperture affects light. Now, photography is of course the art of capturing light, and the aperture is one way in which we can control how much light the camera is able to record. Now, as an example, you may find yourself in a situation where you're taking a photo on a bright sunny day, and you may need to restrict or reduce the light the camera records. Of course, dialing in a larger f number will mean the aperture will get smaller and less light can now pass through the lens. But in contrast, there may well be times when the light levels are low, for example when you're doing night photography, and then you may need to dial in a smaller f number, because remember, a smaller f number means a larger aperture, so now more light can pass through the lens. So now I want to take a look at how we can use the aperture to get really creative, and here I'm talking about depth of field. Take a look at this image. As you can see, the subject is sharp and in focus, but the background is soft and out of focus. What about this second image? Again, the subject is in focus, but now note how the background is much clearer. So the first image was taken using the aperture wide open, and because only a small portion of the image is in focus, we call this a shallow depth of field. But of course, with the second image, more of it is sharp, and this is called a greater depth of field. So depth of field is the term that relates to how much of the image is in focus, and the size of the aperture that we use can play a big part in this. So with these images, the blurry background and very shallow depth of field is a dead giveaway that a large aperture was used. Now, by contrast, landscape photographers usually want the complete opposite. So for this image, which is an urban landscape, of course, I used an aperture of f11. Now, it has to be said that aperture alone isn't affecting depth of field. The focal length of the lens you're using and how close you are to the subject are all factors that will have an effect. Now, if you want to find out more, you may want to check out this video next. You'll find a link in the description below. So now we know that we can use the aperture to control light, but also depth of field. Now what I want to do next is take a brief look at the relationship between aperture and shutter speed. Now in the aperture priority mode, as you adjust the aperture, the camera will also be adjusting the shutter speed and, depending on the camera settings, maybe the ISO as well. Now, one of the benefits of using aperture priority is that the camera will almost certainly be able to find a shutter speed that works simply because there is such a wide range of shutter speeds available. To demonstrate, I've chosen this fair ride as a subject. With the aperture wide open at f4.5, the camera has selected a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second. Next, I closed the aperture right down to f22, so less light can pass through the lens. The camera responds by slowing the shutter speed to 1/5 of a second to allow more time to capture the light. So as you can see, in aperture priority mode, the shutter speed will adjust depending on which aperture you choose to select and how much light is available at the time, and shutter speed affects movement. Now, if you would like to learn more about the special relationship between aperture and shutter speed, I highly recommend checking out this video next. I'll put a link up here, but also in the description below. Now, before I wrap up this video, I do have a great tip that I want to share with you. If you do decide to give aperture priority mode a go, then you can also start taking advantage of a camera feature called exposure compensation. Now, this feature will allow you to adjust the overall exposure. So if you want an image to be slightly darker or likewise slightly brighter, you can do that using exposure compensation. Let me show you how it works. Look for a button or symbol on your camera that looks like this. Then hold down the button and turn the dial to adjust the exposure. Now keep your eye on the camera's meter as you do this to see how much you are over or underexposing your image. Now, if you are using a Fujifilm camera, then good news, because it's very likely that your camera has a dedicated exposure compensation dial on the top, so super easy to use. Exposure compensation is great. It gives you that extra level of control over how your images turn out. And if you want to find out more, you've guessed it, I've already made a video all about exposure compensation where I go into much more detail. You'll find a link coming up in just a second. Now, I really hope you've enjoyed this week's video, and if you did, please consider giving it a thumbs up. It helps the videos get noticed, that helps the channel grow. I want to say a big thank you to NordVPN for supporting me, the channel, and sponsoring this week's video. And that is about it, other than to say thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you again sometime soon. See ya. Bye.